First of all, let me just say how excited I am to be here. Thank you so much, Meg, Hunter, and all of the Power to Fly team. A special shout out to Sienna for the invitation and to Rob for really facilitating what has been a beautiful process of engagement with you all and having the opportunity to talk to all of your participants today. The biography is one thing, I think, as is the case with everyone. Your actual journey is something else. And by that, I mean, our day-to-day working through of what it means to be engaged in the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, and how that kind of comes to be. Clearly, it's not a thing that I thought, when I'm 5 years old, when I grew up, I'm going to be a DEI consultant. Like that very rarely happens. And it didn't happen with me either. It certainly was a process, but I had some very beautiful influences along the way, one of whom is my dad. And I typically start conversations like this, just acknowledging the influence that he had. And, he would be surprised to hear that I have always seen him as a feminist. Since I kind of came into consciousness around what that was for me, because I don't think it's something he would use to describe himself as. And yet he was the one when I was about 4 or 5 years old to kick Barbies out of the house permanently. And he did that because, granted, Barbie of 2024 has an amazing opportunity.
Oh, that's a totally different thing. No, if you're, yes.
Yeah, no, I think Barbie of 2024 is right? Doing big things. But when I was 4 or 5 years old, not to age myself, but it's clear, she had a very narrow focus, right? And so my dad just took a look to the left and to the right, and he saw the world that my brother was engaging in and thought, I don't want to just encourage my daughter to practice being mommy and practice being wife. And that's the extent of her play opportunity. I don't do that with my son. I would like for her to feel like she can do anything and play with anything. And so when he banned Barbies, I went outside, I played with lizards and snakes and spiders and freaked my mother out completely.
Yes.
And then later on became a biologist and ended up studying the diversification of the sciences, really because when I got more and more into the work, I realized what a difference representation can make. And so that's really how I kind of got grounded in this work and why I'm so excited to be here working with you all on just kind of sharing how to do this. Because it's one thing to be aware of it, but there's a really specific skill in engaging with folks and in creating inclusive environments. And that's part of what we at Inclusion Design Group focus on. We're a boutique learning and development company that focuses on training specifically and really upskilling people in this work. So today we're going to talk about microaggressions and really some of the skills involved in learning how to navigate that space.
I like that. Okay, let's level set here. Let's define microaggression so that way everybody's kind of on the same page. What do you consider to be a microaggression?
I think a microaggression is they're typically brief exchanges between people, one of whom is usually very well-intentioned, and yet is exhibiting some form of bias that they may have related to the other person's social identity. And so where their intention may have been one thing, the way that it lands is something else. And so what I often find is that microaggressions are that thing in between intention and impact. So you intended to compliment someone, but it kind of didn't land that way. And it also exposed a bias that you may have about that person and their community.
I like this. And I think this is a really important, kind of clarification to make because it's not just a racial issue. It is something that you can experience a microaggression for a number of different reasons.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think it's really important that we talk about that because I feel like a lot of times if people are not familiar with the term, that racial justice is going to be a lot of the places where they start hearing these. And it's incredibly important. Do not get me wrong, but it's not limited to that. So I think it's really important that we specify that. Let's walk through some kind of examples of microaggressions in the workplace. What are some that you have seen or that you know to be fairly common?
Yeah, I think it's important I love the distinction you make because absolutely it's not just a racial thing. And in the same way that needs to be broadened about who this can happen to, it also, I think, we need to broaden the idea of the kinds of microaggressions that exist in the world. I think a lot of times we're so focused on what is said to one person, and how that person may respond verbally, right? So clearly using heteronormative language is an example of a verbal microaggression. If I walk into a room and I make the assumption that everybody has heterosexual partners by saying to a coworker, hey, why don't you bring your husband or your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whatever that might be. And also around gender and gender expression. I mean, there are microaggressions even in how we're framing that. So depending on the audience, you're going to find that those verbal microaggressions can create real sticking points. And yet those aren't the only kind that there are, right? So there are also behavioral microaggressions. You don't necessarily have to say something to feel that intention, impact, tension, right? So for example, if I'm an organization and I ignore all non-mainstream holidays and only focus on maybe the 2 or 3 big ones every year that happen every year and never raise the fact that there are others that exist for other people within the community, then there's something about the behavior within the organization that's saying, we don't really see what's happening. We don't know what's going on outside of this narrow focus. And I'm not suggesting that you have to go to a calendar and find all 700 holidays and make sure that you call them all out on a loudspeaker every morning. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to encourage all of us to do is just to simply be more conscious of the fact that people don't necessarily live in the same bubble that we live in. And so if you know that, hey, this person from this other social identity may really appreciate if we acknowledge Ramadan, or if we acknowledge Hanukkah, or if we acknowledge, Diwali, whatever it might be, being able to take a moment and say, we're going to just acknowledge this. Also knowing this is not an exhaustive list, we can't do this for everything, but we want to take a moment, right? That's a behavioral microaggression that often exists within the workplace. And then the other piece is that there could be an environmental microaggression. I'll give you an example of what that might be. If I'm in a wheelchair, for example, and come into a building and there is no elevator that would allow me to go to the second floor or the third floor easily, that's an environmental microaggression. It's not that someone is necessarily saying explicitly, I don't think that, your means of getting from one place to another is that important. It doesn't have to be verbal. Environmentally, that creates an impact, even if there's no background intention to create that impact.
Yeah.
The other example around that is the absence of a gender neutral bathroom, something that is been a lot in conversation these days, right? If you need a gender neutral bathroom and don't have one, you have an environmental microaggression that could be taking place.
Yeah, I very much appreciate these examples because I feel like the holiday one, that is absolutely something that a ton of us marinate in, especially in America, where the holidays that get celebrated are generally Christian holidays. Those are usually the ones that are big. Everybody gets off for Christmas. Everybody, a lot of people still got days off work for Easter, which is just so specific a religious holiday. It's bonkers to me. But I think these are really good points to make because there are plenty of times where you might feel a bit weird about something that just happened in the workplace, but that weird feeling might be because there was a microaggression going on. It doesn't even have to be to you. Like I've been in situations and in rooms where something is said and I'm like, what now? That feels weird. You're gonna walk that one back there, Chief? So I very much appreciate, kind of covering some of the ways that these can happen. When it comes to that impact, how do you kind of convey that to people who might not have felt it before? I remember being at a job a couple of years ago and somebody said something about, oh yeah, that person's they're just so crazy. I don't know. I think she's bipolar or something. I live with bipolar 1. It's not particularly great, but it's something I live with. And I know that person was not trying to call me crazy, but it's also someone who actually has that diagnosis, maybe don't say that. Maybe don't joke that somebody's bipolar because this is fun for me or for pretty much anybody else I know with it. So I think it is really important that we talk about some of that impact. Would you be comfortable sharing something that has happened either to you or that you have witnessed and what that impact was, what the impact of that microaggression was on the person?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I actually live in Valencia, Spain, and have lived here for several years and have many very close relationships here. And I can share with you an example, I think, of how this intention impact thing really has worked since I've been here. So when I moved here, I didn't speak Spanish. And so when people compliment me on my Spanish now, there is, I'm just exuding happiness and pride, right? Thank you so, I've worked really hard. Thank you so much. Yes, you know, you've shared that. You think I speak great Spanish? Fantastic. Now, um, I have a very close friend who is also here in Spain and was born here in Spain. And his parents are also Spanish, but his grandparents are from Equatorial Guinea, which means he is of African descent, as am I. Yet, born and raised here, speaks one language, Spanish, right? So when people at work compliment him on his Spanish, how does that make him feel? Right? And he becomes a perpetual foreigner in his own country. And that is something that he has to live with every single day. And their intentions may not be to make him feel so excluded and isolated. And yet the impact clearly is going to be that. And so, again, I give that example also to illustrate how no one thing is going to necessarily impact people in the same way, right?
Yeah.
If you say that to me, I'm excited about it. If you say it to him, he's a bit put off, right? And
Yeah.
so I think it's important to recognize there aren't any hard and fast rules here. I didn't come here to say, well, you know, at the end of this session, I'm going to give you a glossary of things to never, ever, ever, ever say. Everybody's different, right? Clearly, there are some guidelines that can be helpful, right? But like the example you offered earlier, I think that's something we really need to talk a lot more about because microaggressions related to neurodivergence are rampant. And, you know, it's really important that we have these conversations and that people begin to be more empathetic and compassionate around that. But there are a number of other microaggressions that are going to hit people one way and hit others in a different way. And for me, I think it's important that we not let it just slide by. You know, we like to say, be an upstander, not a bystander. And yet, it's important not to, especially at work, create what people would look at as a call out culture. We like to
Right,
talk
it just
about
makes
creating
people
a call.
nervous.
Exactly. You know, and then it makes people not say anything to anyone, not create relationships with people who are different than them because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. I mean, it has this real avalanche effect. And I think it's important to call people in a way that doesn't undermine morale. And so we teach a tool with Inclusion Design Group around interrupting this kind of bias and interrupting microaggressions. If you see something or you are present and witness this, where the first step is to just kind of ask for more information, ask a clarifying question. Hey, can you say more about that? Like, what do you know, what did you really
Yeah.
mean when you shared, can you tell me a little bit more about how you came to that conclusion? Like, why did you feel this way? Like, what makes you feel that she has bipolar 1? Is that a diagnosis that she shared with you? And usually just saying that will get them to repeat themselves and hear it, right? Usually that's what happens.
Honestly, I've done
If
that
it
before.
doesn't,
Like they
yeah,
said it
yeah,
and I was like, "Oh, really? Me too." And the look on their faces, I'm
yeah.
not gonna lie, y'all, that was so satisfying. So satisfying to see them be like, "Yeah, I'm hella mentally ill. Let's talk about this. This is great. Oh, add them to the club.
Yeah.
Yay."
Yeah, no, I mean, sometimes, and you know, if we don't create learning opportunities for people, it just continues to perpetuate the cycle.
Yeah.
So it is important to say something and not just let it go by. But depending on your personality, how you respond to that can differ. So I think just starting by a simple, hey, can you tell me more about that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? Or I'm really interested in why you think that. That oftentimes gets them to take the bias statement and put it aside and get more along the lines of any evidence they may have, or usually what happens is an acknowledgement that actually I don't have any evidence for that. You know what? I think maybe what I meant to say is perhaps I should, you know, it just shifts things a bit.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
second thing you might want to try is to share with them a little bit about this intention impact dynamic. In a simple sentence, it could be something like, hey, I know you may not realize this, but when you say X, it can actually make people feel like Y, or you know, you might have a different impact than what you intended when you said that. When you said that, maybe to better align yourself with what your intention was, you may want to try da 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 da, right?
Yeah.
And then the last thing is to share your own experience and challenge the stereotype directly, just as in the example you just shared. Just challenging it directly might be, you know what? In my experience, labeling someone as bipolar without a diagnosis can be really, just kind of speaking
Yeah.
directly to the point. So those are just three possible tools that people can use if they're looking to kind of interrupt that microaggression loop and help people to see things from a different perspective.
I like this. And I very much appreciate this focus because when we're talking about like you said, kind of like breaking that line, right? Between like, here's what I said, and I think it's going to have this, this impact, and then it doesn't. And I like the idea of kind of interrupting that. But I also really appreciate that we're having this conversation in terms of interrupting it, not by being like, back, you sit down, take several seats, sir. No, we're not
Yeah,
doing that. Like shaming somebody is a very effective way of getting them to remember, but it's also not real productive. So,
right.
if we are trying to interrupt these things, it absolutely behooves us to try and figure out a way to interrupt it that doesn't end the conversation, right? You want the
Exactly.
conversation to continue, you just want it to continue in a better method than it previously was. How can organizations help support their employees if they want to create this culture, not like you said, not a cancel culture, but like a culture of like, hey, let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing that an organization can do for its employees is contribute to the culture in the specific way of making it okay to talk about things, right? If you want to create a call in culture instead of a call out culture, you have to know what you're calling people into. Well, who's determining that? Who's setting up the norms for the culture? Even just sitting down and having a conversation and saying, how do we want people to feel here? Or what are some of the things that keep people from feeling that? What are some of the things that actually promote us feeling that way? How do we want to talk about this? Who needs grace in this room from time to time, right? Who wants to feel like no one will ever be held accountable if they say something that's wildly offensive? Right? So, how do we find the balance, team? Just introducing these kinds of conversations and coming up with sets of norms that in your context really work, along with providing training and opportunities for people to know how to do this work is super important. I know obviously I'm biased because that's what we do. And I have to say, it's not the only way. People certainly should be responsible for their own education. You should be continuing your own education every day and all the time. And I can't tell you how many people I have come in contact with where they are bought into this idea of diversity and inclusion, but have absolutely no idea what to say. If someone comes to them and says, hey, I think you talk over women during meetings. Oh, well, I have two daughters and I would never, because,
Oh
and
God.
even as they're saying it, they're just like doing this mentally, flailing
Wacky
about.
wavable. Yes. It's very like
And
Muppet-esque,
it,
right? Of like, no, that's not what I meant. And it's not that it's not
right.
valid, right? And it's not that it's not sincerely felt, but the Muppet doesn't really help anyone. It very much entertains me, don't get me wrong. And I'll be Muppet all day long, but like it's not progressing the conversation.
Exactly. And and they want to know how. They really do. They want to know how. And so I think one of the things that organizations can do is show them, give them the opportunity to learn, and really support an environment in which that kind of learning is expected, is embraced, is encouraged, and is incentivized at some level. So I think that's something organizations can absolutely do to support that. Have the conversation, set up norms, even if it seems pedantic. Sometimes we get caught up in, why are we're not in the first grade. We know, treat everyone with respect and that's it. And yet, we come into these issues every day amongst respectful people. It's not like everybody we're talking about who's committing microaggressions are blatantly disrespectful people. They
Mhm.
aren't setting out necessarily to hurt people's feelings. Although that's the case in a small percentage of cases, that is not what we typically see. So
Yeah.
how do we come into this over and over again? It's because people need to really be educated around this. And it's not just the responsibility of the organization, and organizations certainly can do a lot to push that forward.
Yeah, I like this. And I want to call out, well, not call out, I want to highlight again what you talked about of that call in culture instead of call out culture. It very much kind of it reminds me of my mom tells me to, she kind of refers to it as painting people into the nice corner, right? Somebody says something, it kind of comes out of pocket and you're like, the what? But instead of being like, huh? what are you talking about? And like kind of rude, you can just be like, oh man, I am sure you did not mean it like this. Can you like kind of dive in a little bit deeper on that? I'm sure you didn't mean to be super sexist. Can we can you clarify for me what you were trying to get at with that topic? And it really does kind of like, I'm giving you the out, you better take it. And if you don't, you're going to have to double down on kind of being a jerk right now. And so like I like this idea of making it a thing where it's like, no, 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 no. Saying like, hey, that's not okay does not mean like bad puppy, shame forever. It's
Yeah.
just like, no, we're not going to do it like that. We're going to do it like this so that we're not throwing unintentional roadblocks into our own progress here.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you've named already the thing that you want to be as a culture, then you are able to pin it on the behavior. You're able to pin it on the thing you want to be. Hey, let's deviate from this biased line of thinking in our performance review. Because remember, we said we wanted to not utilize these kinds of biases, and it's not targeting the person or labeling the person. That's what people are afraid of. They don't want to be labeled as sexist, racist, homophobic. Nobody wants that.
yeah.
So if we're able to now tag it to a behavior because of a norm in the culture, it lets everybody kind of breathe a little bit easier when the thing that they've actually said or done is what's being called in.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, let's kind of dive in a little bit on this. If somebody realizes that they have been unintentionally microaggressive towards others, once we have
Yes.
hopefully short-circuited and avoided the Muppet moment, how can they respond with empathy? The person who has been microaggressive, how can that person respond with empathy and really take steps towards rectifying that behavior?
Wonderful question. It's the thing we get asked all the time. It's the thing that we all secretly want to know how to do better. And I'll tell you, it's a skill, something that needs to be practiced and that you do get better at, like any other skill. And there's a tool that we teach an inclusion design group called Learn. And Learn stands for first, lean into the discomfort. Lean into the discomfort. Acknowledge that you are uncomfortable. Let your shoulders down. Take a deep breath. Because if we aren't able to do that, we end up backpedaling and running away from the conversation as quickly as we can. So just acknowledge the fact that you're uncomfortable. Just sit with it and make a commitment to be present in that. The second piece is E, engage in active listening. You really want to just be quiet at first. You should not be doing all the talking. Let the person who's sharing this feedback with you say what it is that they need to say, listen to them, use whatever kinds of body posture cues that you need to demonstrate so that they feel heard in the moment. The third thing is appreciate the feedback. If the very first thing you say after they've shared this moment with you is thank you, it lets so much of the tension out of the room. Even if you don't agree, even if you don't understand, if you just say thank you so much for bringing this to me, I really appreciate you sharing your perspective with me. Thank you. That thank you is priceless. And it should be sincere because again, even if you don't agree, even if you don't understand, someone took the risk of bringing you this information, especially in the workplace, right? And that's something that you have to appreciate because otherwise you wouldn't have known and they could have gone about it in an entirely different way. The next letter in the acronym is R, which is recognize your responsibility for the impact that it's had on the person, not necessarily for your intentions, but for the impact. If we think about emotional intelligence, right? I'll give you an example. If you're at a coffee shop and I'm standing behind you, Meg, and I spill coffee, hot coffee, all over you, what do I do next? Should I start talking to you about how I didn't mean to, how this person behind me was pushing, how I'm usually very coordinated, how my, partner actually is a professional athlete? And no, that has nothing to do with anything. The emotion intelligent thing to do is to say, Meg, are you okay? Can I get you a napkin, right? Express care. You want to lead with the expression of care. Don't lead with talk conversations about your intentions or who you are in the community. It's really important to remember that piece. Recognize your responsibility. Again, not for your intentions, but for the impact it's had on that person. Because whether or not you've meant it, it's impacted them in a negative way. The last piece, N, is about next steps. The best way you can respond to anything is actually to do something about it, right? And I should also say, not becoming effusively apologetic, which is the other extreme from becoming defensive, is also important, because what often happens is people start to feel like they've got to take care of you. Oh, it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. I'm all right. You turn around,
Like
I
you
spill
think you're,
coffee on you.
yeah.
Yeah. And next thing you know, you're patting me on the back, like, don't cry. I'm okay. It didn't burn me that badly. Like, what are we talking
Well,
about?
yeah, it goes to kind of like
Yeah,
centering yourself in the discussion as opposed to centering the person who is like, I don't want to say at issue, that makes it sound like the problem, but like the person who has been negatively impacted or has been impacted here, like that is the
exactly.
focal point, not you.
Exactly. Exactly that. So that piece you want to do last is really think about, how do I move this forward? And maybe next steps in your situation, like the example I gave earlier about someone talking over women during meetings. Maybe your next step is to say to that individual, you know what, we're going to do a round robin at the end of every meeting, and I want to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to say their piece. Or maybe your next step is, hey, I'm going to take some time and really continue my own education on this topic, and really, make sure that I'm listening and responding in a way that's appropriate next time. Or, and you can invite the input of the impacted person, but you should not be relying on them to solve the issue for you. Don't just turn it over, because that's just giving them more work, right? You can invite their input, but don't insist on them being a participant in it. And so that's it. I think, kind of just ending that with like, what are we going to do next? And even if you don't know, you can say, hey, can I circle back? Right. That's also a very legitimate way to close that, is to say, I want to look into some other resources around this, and I'll get back to you. Just make sure you do. Because you don't have to have all the answers right at once.
I like this a lot. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask you one more question that we'll do kind of
Okay.
hot potato style. Now,
Okay.
obviously, microaggressions is a term that gets tossed around a lot, and sometimes media coverage isn't necessarily well thought out for it. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions on microaggression?
Wow. I think people have this idea that people who commit microaggressions have to be racist or sexist or homophobic to their core, and that they could never commit a microaggression because they're none of those things. It's this everything all at once, and yet nothing anywhere ever kind of contradiction and phenomenon. Um, if you ask someone, hey, are we all a little bit racist? Yeah, we're all a little bit racist. Okay, so are you racist? Oh, no, 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 no. So then what? It's I think there's a real simplification around that. And the reality is every single one of us is biased. We're brought up in a world full of biases. We live in our own bubbles. We don't know everything about everything. We don't know how what we say is going to necessarily impact someone else. And we're all on a journey and in a process of learning. And so I think that's the biggest misconception, is that if you are committing a microaggression, it's because you must be one of these horrible labels. And that's just simply not the case. All of us are susceptible, myself included, constantly to committing microaggressions.
Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been honestly wonderful. I'm sorry we ran out of time before we were able to get to all of the questions that we wanted to ask you. But truly, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. I sincerely hope we'll get to do this again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meg. You've been a wonderful host. I felt so comfortable, which is probably why I talked a whole lot. So yeah, no, this has been great. Thank you so much once again. And to
Thank
all of you at the Power to Fly community.
Oh yeah, truly. And honestly, y'all, Dr. Conner called out some great behind the scenes Power to Fly people who honestly do not get their praises sung enough. So Rob and all of our behind the scenes people, we really appreciate you. Bridget in the green room, everybody. Thank you so much for all of this.